I never wished him dead, but right now I see more hope for the future than I have in years. She raised slightly shocked eyes to Charlie. I am an awful woman to feel that way, aren't I? Charlie shook her head solemnly. Nay, you are a woman with 2 children to raise, clothe, and feed. And you have been trying to do so alone for quite some time, while your husband stole the roof from over your head and gambled it away. Now you're free of the sickness he had and the hold it had over your life. You can start fresh. There is hope. There is no shame in embracing it. The woman considered that silently, then nodded. You are a good man, my lord. I've been praying for help for a long time. I think surely God must have sent you to me in answer to those prayers. I'll be the best cook I can be. I am sure you will do fine, Charlie murmured, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Now, we had best go below before your Mr. Wickman comes looking for us. Moving to the door, she held it open and ushered the threesome out and back downstairs. Radcliffe and Wickman were still on the front stoop. At Radcliffe's questioning glance, Charlie merely shook her head and followed Mrs. Hartshare and her children into the carriage. Radcliffe entered after Charlie, then sat to eye the woman and her 2 children seated on the opposite bench seat. He experienced a definite sense of déjà vu. Only the memory mixing with this reality was of Bessie seated fearfully on the bench. Sighing inwardly, he shook his head and sat silently for the duration of the ride home. "It would seem we have guests, Stokes," Radcliffe announced, slapping his gloves and hat into the butler's waiting hand as the man gaped at the woman and children who trailed him into the house. "Not exactly guests," Charlie corrected gently as she followed the family into the house and pushed the door closed. "Oh?" Radcliffe arched one supercilious eyebrow at the lad. "Pray tell." "You are in need of a cook, as I recall, unless you have already made arrangements." Radcliffe grimaced. "You know I have hardly had the opportunity for that." Charlie breathed a small sigh of relief. She had not thought he had done so yet, but if he had, that would have been a complication indeed. "Well, now you need not bother. You need a cook. Mrs. Hartshare is a cook." Radcliffe blinked at the simple announcement, then glanced toward the woman for verification. "You are a cook?" "Aye," she swallowed nervously, as her gaze slid around the luxurious foyer before she added unhappily, I am a cook, but I'm a fair hand at buns and such, but the sort of food I can cook is—" She glanced at Charlie, who gave her an encouraging smile. Straightening slightly, the woman murmured, "'Tis tasty, hearty food, my lord, but I know naught about fancies and pastries and the like." "That will not be a problem," Charlie assured her quickly. "His lordship never entertains. Besides, his last cook could not even boast tasty or hearty fare, and you shall learn anything necessary over time. Is that not right, Radcliffe?" There was a moment of silence, just long enough to make Charlie glance at him in reprimand, at which he nodded solemnly. "Aye, 'tis quite true. I am sure you will do very well." His gaze went to the weary and bedraggled children hanging onto their mothers' skirts, and he murmured, "Your children look as if they are all in. Stokes will show you to your room." "Thank you, my lord," the woman gasped, her face blossoming into near beauty with relief. "Thank you." Nodding, Radcliffe glanced towards Stokes expectantly, frowning at the servant's stunned expression and the way he gazed, unmoving, upon the widow. "Stokes," he prompted, drawing the man's attention. "Show them to a room." "Of course, my lord." The servant actually blushed slightly, Charlie noticed. Radcliffe grunted and turned to her. "In the library, Charles." She grimaced at the autocratic tone, but paused to suggest to Stokes that he offer the Hartshare some food before seeing them to bed. The 3 looked pale and thin to her. They could use some meat on their bones. And she doubted they had eaten that day. When the man assured her he would see to it, she turned, resignedly, and followed Radcliffe's trail to the library. He was standing at the sideboard pouring himself a drink when she entered. A stiff drink, She could not help but notice as she settled in a seat before the desk to await the lecture she knew would come. She'd not have long to wait. "My home is not a refuge for runaways and waifs, Charles." "Runaways?" Her eyes widened innocently as she watched him cross the room to take his seat at the desk. "I have brought no runaways here, my lord." His brows drew together in displeasure. "You know what I mean, Charles." Well, she sighed briefly, then shook her head. "Actually, no, I do not. I am hardly using your home as some sort of charity workshop, Radcliffe. Beth needed a maid, and I found her a maid. You needed a cook, and I have found you a cook. The fact that both women were in untenable situations when I found them is merely coincidental." This fine argument, one she was rather proud of, was blown to the four winds by a child's sudden squeal of "Puppies!" from the hallway, followed by a shout from Stokes and the scampering of little feet. Charlie could picture what was happening in the hall. Stokes had led the Hartshares to the kitchens to feed them, unthinkingly opening the kitchen door, only to have the puppies make a grand escape. All, no doubt, to the children's glee. They were now surely chasing little creatures about, attempting to recapture them. Charlie almost smiled at the pictures running through her head, but she managed to restrain herself when she caught the expression on Radcliffe's face. "As I said," he muttered grimly, "you must stop collecting people and puppies." "Of course, Radcliffe. You are right. I shall refrain from rescuing any more wayward strays," she murmured soberly. Radcliffe sighed heavily. "I wish I believed that." "Oh, you can. After all, there are no more positions in the house to fill, are there?" "I did not have a position for puppies," he pointed out. Well, he was going to kill them," she said helplessly, and Radcliffe dropped his head into his hands and began massaging his scalp, making her ask sympathetically, "Does your head ache? Mayhap you should take yourself off to bed." Standing wearily, he gestured for Charles to lead the way, then followed her to the door. Charlie felt a sense of relief that the lecture was over, until she opened the library door. The puppies were gone, apparently having been recaptured and taken away. However, Beth and Thomas Mulberry were in a clinch just inside the front door. Slamming the door, she whirled to face a wincing Radcliffe. "I just had a thought. Mayhap a nice massage would ease your ache. You just sit yourself down right over here, and I shall see what I can do." Charlie started to urge him toward the desk, but Radcliffe dug his heels in halfway across the room. "Thank you for the offer, Charles. However, I think you had it right the first time. Bed will cure what ails me." "Oh, but—" Charlie hurried after him as he started back across the room, throwing herself in front of the door when he would have opened it. "What about tomorrow?" He stared at her blankly. "Tomorrow? Do we have any plans?" He shifted impatiently. "We can discuss that at breakfast, Charles. But I have a headache, Charles. Please get out of the way so that I can go lie down and be rid of it." Shoulders drooping, Charlie stepped aside, opened the door and followed him into the hall. The empty hall. Much to her relief, neither Beth nor Thomas Mulberry were anywhere in sight. She followed Radcliffe silently up the stairs, pausing at the top when he suddenly stopped. She glanced at him questioningly. "I forgot all about Elizabeth." When she raised an eyebrow questioningly, he explained, "I left her at the ball with the Mulberrys. They promised to see her home. I suppose I had better check and see that she has returned, and all is well." "I shall do that," she volunteered quickly. "You go ahead, and lie down." When he hesitated, she hurried past him to Elizabeth's door and knocked briefly. The minute it started to open, she turned to offer Radcliffe a reassuring smile, then gasped as she was grabbed by her arm and tugged quickly inside the room. "Charlie, you won't believe what a wonderful time I had. It was marvelous, fantastic, amazing." Pushing the door closed, Beth whirled Charlie around the room gleefully, then released her and collapsed backward on the bed with a huge sigh to hug herself.
"What a stupendous night!"
"So I saw," Charlie murmured dryly, seating herself on the bed beside her as the girl coloured prettily.
"Was that you in the library?"
she asked, her nose wrinkling. "I did wonder." "Wonder? Are you mad? If Radcliffe had caught you at your antics—"
"But he did not,"
she laughed, and dropped back upon the bed, only to sit up abruptly again. "Did you pay off the blackmailer? Radcliffe did not find you, did he?" "Nay, and I," Charlie answered in order, then went on to explain the night's adventures, running through them quite briefly, since it was obvious that her sister was not paying much attention. When she fell silent, Beth immediately began to regale her with her own evening, which seemed incredibly dull in comparison. She had danced with Thomas, talked with Lady Mulberry, danced with Thomas, discussed fashion with Lady So-and-so. Then she danced with Thomas again, and so her evening had seemed to have gone. Compared to her own night, Beth's evening seemed terribly tame. Her mind had begun to wander when she caught her sister's last words.
"So, you may be Elizabeth during the day, but I should like to be me in the evening again, at the Woolcots' ball. You do not mind, do you?"
Charlie sat still for a moment, her heart seeming to have dropped into her stomach somewhere. Then she shook her head and rose wearily. "Nay, of course not."
"Oh, thank you, Charlie. I knew you would not let me down."
Nodding, she moved to the connecting door and started out of the room, then turned back. "I suppose you should sleep in Charles's room tonight, then?"
"Oh, aye."
Bouncing off the bed, Beth moved cheerfully across the room, kissing her sister's cheek affectionately before closing the door behind her with a cheery,
"Good night."
Charlie stared at that door for several moments, feeling vaguely cheated. She had to find a husband, too. Her own need for one was even more pressing than Beth's, really. After all, while Seguin may not be every girl's dream come true, at least he was not dangerous like Carland. And there was the source of her upset, she realized glumly. They were supposed to be taking turns here at being the girl. Both of them were supposed to have their chance at finding a husband, yet it seemed that Charlie was spending most of her time playing Charles, and most of her time was spent in the company of Radcliffe. She would never find a husband that way. Straightening her shoulders grimly, she marched into Charles's room, startling Beth as she started to crawl under the bedcovers.
"Charlie, what is it? Is something wrong?"
"I'm afraid I disagree with your playing Elizabeth tomorrow night. To date, the Hardings' ball is the only event at which I have been the sister and allowed to hunt up a husband, and then Mowbray and Radcliffe clung to me like limpets the whole time. If we are to take turns at this, as you suggested, then take turns we shall. Tomorrow evening is my turn to be a girl and look for a husband. If you wish, I shall be Charles during the day tomorrow, but in the evening I will be Elizabeth." Beth opened her mouth to complain at the switch, then paused, shame covering her expression. "I am sorry," she said at last. "You are absolutely right. 'Tis your turn. Besides, your need for a husband is more pressing than mine. I do already at least have my eye on someone. Of course, you must be Elizabeth tomorrow night. And during the day, too," she added firmly. "I shall even endeavour to keep Tom and Radcliffe away from you tomorrow evening, so that you might find someone you are interested in without their interference." Charlie's shoulders sagged suddenly in relief and weariness. "Charlie," Beth murmured when she started to turn away. "Aye, this was a good thing, I think." She stared at her blankly. "What?"
"All of this."
She waved vaguely around the room, then explained,
"Having to escape, meeting up with Radcliffe, ending up in London, fending for ourselves. Well, with a little help from Radcliffe, of course."
Charlie shook her head. "I do not think I understand."
"It is changing us. I have always been terribly shy. You know that. But here I am, learning to deal with social situations better. And you have never really stood up for yourself, or what you want, yet twice now you have done it here."
Charlie blinked at that. "What on earth do you mean I have never stood up for myself before?
I am forever standing up for myself, rebelling and such. My God, Beth, you make me sound like a coward. Nay, never a coward. You have a great deal of courage. You've always been a grand champion for others, but only for others. You never stand up for what you want. Seeing the bewilderment on her face, Beth explained. The dresses, for instance. For years you have put up with my choices, never complaining once, let alone demanding. Charlie waved that away impatiently. Dresses? What did they matter in the country? Besides, you were going through all the fittings. You had every right to choose. But I did not mind the fittings, and while I was doing those, you were doing something else. Something I disliked doing, like mucking out the stables. Well, after Uncle Henry let go all of his staff, old Ben had a rough time keeping up with things. He needed help. I know. But I detested working in the stables. You did not mind it so much, so you did it while I went for the fittings. 'Twas an equal trade, and you should have had a say in what gowns you wore as much as me. You never said a word, until now. Just as with everything else, you let me have my way. Until now, you would have let me attend the ball as Elizabeth. In fact, your first instinct was to let me. But then you stood up for yourself and said it was your turn. Well, aye. But this is a matter of my life. Do I not find a husband? I shall have to marry Carland, and he would kill me. I must find a husband. I must have my equal turns. I see. So you are saying that you are only doing this because your life is more important than my pleasure? Charlie blinked in amazement that she would even ask the question. Well, of course my life is more important than your pleasure. Beth nodded solemnly. Yet your pleasure is less important than mine. Charlie frowned. How do you come to that conclusion? That is what you have said. You are not letting me have my way this time because your life is at stake. You let me have my way with the dresses because it was simply a matter of taste. Yours versus mine. Mine was more important. You are twisting things, Charlie muttered impatiently. Am I? Then what of our birthday dinners? What are you talking about now? Cook always asked what we would wish for our birthday dinner, and I always chose roast duckling and blueberry tort. So, you detest duck, and blueberries, while you like them, are not your favourite flavour of tort. Please get to your point, Beth. But that is my point. Had things been fair, we would have had roast duckling and blueberry tort one year, and a meal of your choice the next. Or we would have had roast duckling and your choice of dessert one year, then your choice of meal and blueberry tort the next. But nay, for the past several years, we had roast duckling and blueberry tort on our birthday. Seeing that what she was saying was sinking in, Beth murmured, You did things like that all the time, Charlie. You stood up for everyone, from the village drunk to me. Everyone but yourself. And you always put others' wants before your own. 'Twas as if you thought everyone else was better than yourself. I bet that if Uncle Henry had arranged marriages between myself and Sir Gwyn, and between you and someone similarly disgusting but harmless, you would have gone ahead and married the old coot. Charlie grimaced, but did not deny it. And I blame Uncle Henry. She gave a laugh at that. Something else to blame him for? Beth's chin rose. Well, he was constantly criticizing you. He was forever calling you stupid and cheap, and her shoulders slumped. And it was all my fault, she finished miserably. Charlie's head shot up. Your fault? Good Lord, Beth. Well, it was sometimes. The times he would start out picking at me for something, and you would jump to my defense. He would turn his anger on you then, and leave me alone, she sighed. Mayhap had I returned the favour and defended you back, he may have left us both alone. But she raised stark eyes to her sister. I was so afraid of his temper. Charlie moved to her side at once, placing a comforting arm around her. I know. 'Tis all right. Nay, 'tis not. I am ashamed of myself. You are not afraid.
Of course I was. Beth stilled at that, eyes wide and incredulous. You were? Of course. Uncle Henry has a terrible temper. I was terrified every time I faced him. So you see, there is nothing for you to be ashamed of. I was afraid too. Oh, but this is worse, Beth breathed with dismay. Do you not see? You were afraid like I was, but you stood up to him anyway. That is true courage, Charlie. While my allowing my fear to hold me back was cowardice. Beth, Charlie shook her impatiently. Stop it, for heaven's sake. As if we do not have enough to worry about. Anyone with any sense would have kept their mouth shut and let his criticisms run their course, ignoring everything that man said. Now, why do you not go to your room and get some sleep? I am in my room. Charles sleeps here, and I am to be Charles tomorrow. I thought you might wish to be Elizabeth during the day, since I am going to be... Nay, I shall be Charles all day and night. Chapter 13. The Fetterleys' ballroom was filled to capacity with men and women, all a-sparkle in their finery. It was also unbearably hot, and the fact that she had been dancing non-stop since arriving wasn't helping much, Charlie thought, fanning her face with one hand as she followed the steps of the dance. I did not realize that Radcliffe had any cousins, Lady Elizabeth. Charlie glanced sharply at her dance partner, Lord North something or other. She hadn't really caught the name. She hadn't caught the names of most of the men she had danced with this evening. But then, none of them had been all that memorable anyway. This one at least was taller than she was, had all his teeth, and hadn't stepped on her toes yet. Actually, he was rather attractive, too, she realized with some surprise, peering at his face for the first time since he had cut in on her dance with Lord whoever. He had blue eyes, nice features, and light blonde hair. He was also nearly as tall as Radcliffe, with shoulders almost as wide as his. Is there something on my nose? Realizing that she had been staring, Charlie flushed and dropped her gaze. Nay, my lord, she murmured, her mind returning to the comment he had made. Do you know Lord Radcliffe well? She asked cautiously after a moment. As well as anyone, I would wager. His sister was married to my brother. Mary, she whispered the name sadly, then tilted her head to look at her dance partner. You met Charles at Radcliffe's club, she recalled Beth telling her. Aye, a charming lad, though not as charming as his sister. Flushing at the compliment, she glanced away, wondering how she was to feel him out, to see if he was possible husband material. He was the first likely candidate she had met so far. The fact that he was tall, confident, attractive, and a good dancer already put him far above the other men she had met that night. And he came from a good family. It had to be good if Radcliffe had let his sister marry into it. Are you married? Considering me as husband material, my lady? He teased. Charlie flushed, but managed an unconcerned shrug. Is that not what these balls are all about? Aye, but usually the ladies are more subtle about it. I am single, he added gently, then teased. No diseases that I know of, and quite capable of producing heirs. Charlie flushed again, and he laughed softly. How charming you are, blunt and to the point, yet you blush deliciously. Does that blush go all the way down, I wonder? When her eyes went round and she stumbled slightly, he pulled her against his chest to steady her, his hand sliding to the base of her spine and applying gentle pressure. Charlie swallowed, confused by her responses, as his body caressed hers through their clothes. There was the excitement she had experienced with Radcliffe, and yet it was different. With Radcliffe it had been pure, unadulterated pleasure. Her heart had leapt, and she had followed it, revelling in the sensations. With this man there was an edge to the excitement. Where she trusted Radcliffe not to hurt her, she instinctively knew this man did not worry overmuch about any consequences. He could ruin a woman without regret. Radcliffe would never do so. His sense of right and wrong was too strong. "Does the blush go all the way down?" he whispered seductively in her ear, and Charlie swallowed as a shiver convulsed her. Feeling out of her depth, she cast her eyes about in search of Beth and Radcliffe. Her gaze was halfway around the room when she caught a glimpse of a man that made her stumble again, hard. Ralphie. "Are you all right?" he murmured with concern, steadying her. Nay," she managed an apologetic smile. "I fear I have overdone the dancing, my lord. Would you mind terribly if I cried off the rest of this dance?" "I am shattered. But I should not wish you to faint from overexertion," he murmured. Gallantly, taking her arm, he led her off the floor, his gaze sweeping over the ice-blue gown she wore, with its needle-lace trim and silk-lined sashes in a darker blue. "I noticed you had not set out a single dance since arriving. Mayhap a cool beverage would revive you," he suggested, solicitously, as he saw her seated in one of the few empty chairs lining the wall. "Shall I fetch you one?" "Please," Charlie murmured, her gaze drifting around the room as soon as he moved away. She wasn't sure, but she thought Ralphie had seen her and might approach her now that she was alone.
"There you are!"
Beth appeared before her suddenly in the new fawn breeches and coat that had arrived that afternoon.
"You are a difficult one to keep track of."
Charlie nearly smiled at that complaint. She knew Beth had known exactly where she was all evening, but had been misdirecting Radcliffe as promised. Tom had made her job easier by not showing up to need distracting. "We saw you dancing with Norwich." Radcliffe's disapproval was obvious. "Norwich?" It took her a moment to realize that he meant her dance partner. "Oh, aye, the heat was affecting me adversely, so he went to fetch me a beverage." "It was more likely the fact that he was holding you too damn close that was affecting you adversely," Radcliffe snapped, then forced a smile. "Come, I think some fresh air may do more to revive you than a beverage and his presence." "Oh, but—" she began, grimacing when he raised an eyebrow at her in question. "Well, I really would like a drink. Besides, is it not rude to just disappear on him?" "I shall fetch you a drink in a moment," he promised, urging her toward the doors to the terrace. "As for being rude, it was rude of him to hold you so closely on the dance floor." "Still, Radcliffe, it does seem unconscionably ill-mannered to simply leave like this," Beth murmured, following them. "Then, Charles, you should probably stay behind to explain that Elizabeth was feeling faint, needed some air, and is now in my care." Beth's eyes widened, her footsteps faltering. "Oh, but—" Whatever she wanted to say was lost to them as Radcliffe drew Charlie onto the terrace and closed the doors with a decided snap. "Self-absorbed, spoiled little whelp," he muttered, leading her to the railing that ran the length of the terrace. "Are we still talking about Norwich?" Charlie asked with amusement. She had never seen Radcliffe so upset. He was acting almost jealous. "He should not have risked subjecting you to possible scandal that way." "Scandal? We were not dancing that closely," Charlie argued with exasperation. "Had the two of you been unclothed, you would have been making love." "But I do not love him, and we were not unclothed. And we were no closer than this." The last came out a bit breathlessly as she realized how close they were. They had gravitated toward each other with each word they had spoken. Now she smiled at him, unaware of the hunger in her eyes, or the seductive quality of her voice as she murmured, "Does that mean if we were unclothed, we would be making love?" "Elizabeth." Her name was a groan on his lips as he took her in his arms and kissed her with all the pent-up frustration he had experienced that evening, as he had watched her flit from the arms of one man to another. Charlie melted in his arms like chocolate over the fire. Her arms slid up around his neck, her hands gliding into his hair, her lips opening hungrily beneath his. It was hot, sweet, and over quickly. It seemed to her that it had just begun, and he was gently setting her away with a groan. Charlie opened her eyes slowly, disappointment and hunger plain in her eyes. Seeing it, Radcliffe released a pent-up sigh, then offered her a regretful smile. "Perhaps I should fetch you that punch now," he murmured huskily, then moved away, slipping through the partially open doors they had come through moments earlier. Charlie watched him go with a sigh of her own. Her body was humming, desire thrumming through her veins like a living thing. She could still taste him on her lips, she realized unhappily as she stared blindly at the dancers swirling by the doors. In comparison, Norridge's effect on her when he had pressed her close on the dance floor had been rather tepid. Groaning inwardly, she turned away from the windows, only to pause as a movement from the shadows caught her eye. She was tensing in anxiety when a figure suddenly moved into the light from the terrace doors.
"Tomas!"
She greeted him with a strangled voice, her eyes shifting instinctively toward the door that Radcliffe had just stepped through, the door that had been open when they'd stopped kissing, but that he had closed behind them when they'd come out. How long had he been standing there watching them? A hard grasp on her upper arm drew her gaze reluctantly around to see that he now stood before her, and he was furious.
"You did not mention that you and Radcliffe were kissing cousins."
He was just—" she stammered, her mind searching for a discarding explanation after explanation. Not that Tomas seemed in the mood to listen, anyway, she decided with a sigh, as he drew her closer in a mockery of an embrace.
"Or is it just that you share your kisses with everyone?"
"Now, Tomas," Charlie tried a soothing tone as she pressed her palms flat against his chest, attempting to ease some space between them. He was neither willing to be soothed nor held at bay. A growl of what Charlie presumed was strangled rage sounded from his throat. Then his head suddenly swooped down to cover her lips with his own. Charlie was too stunned to react at first, and then she was too disappointed. She felt absolutely nothing. His lips were firm and warm and moved across her own with obvious skill, and yet he might as well have kissed a post for all the response he managed to wring from her. The contrast between her lack of response to him and her weak-kneed, fluttery tummy response to Radcliffe was terrifying to her. What if Radcliffe was the only one who could stir her in that way? What if no one else could raise her passions? Recognizing her lack of response, Tomas redoubled his efforts, his tongue sweeping over her lips and pushing into her mouth. Charlie remained pliant in his arms and simply waited, her body remaining stubbornly uninterested. This was horrible. Her gasps finally brought the tepid embrace to an end. Pulling apart, they turned as one to see Radcliffe standing frozen in the door, a drink in hand. He looked shocked, frozen even, but no more so than Beth, who stood beside him. Groaning inwardly, Charlie fatalistically awaited the outburst of rage that was burning in Radcliffe's eyes. There was none, however. As quick as a blink, he forced the rage from his face, stepped forward, handed her the drink with a cold, courtly bow, then turned and walked back into the ball. Sighing, she looked down into the drink briefly, then glanced at Tomas, who, taking a page from Radcliffe's book, suddenly bowed toward her with stiff dignity, then walked into the building as well. It figures, Charlie thought wryly, just like a man. Kiss a girl, then blame her for it. She hadn't asked either man to kiss her, had she? Yet here they were, both of them, storming off as if discovering she was some sort of tart. Men. Her gaze slid to Beth to find her glaring daggers. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Charlie snapped. "You do not think I asked him to kiss me, do you?" When Beth's anger wavered, she added, "He came out to see Radcliffe kissing me, and—" "Radcliffe kissed you again?" Charlie waved the question away impatiently. "Aye, and Tomas saw it. Waited in the shadows until he left. Then he gave me a furious kiss of his own, and it was awful." Beth straightened in offence at that. "Tomas is a very good kisser." "I am sure he is, but not for me. I do not feel a thing when he kissed me. What is more, it seemed pretty obvious that he was disappointed in the kiss as well." Eyes widening, Beth turned and glanced back into the ballroom. "Oh no," she gasped. "He is leaving." She raced off to chase after him, leaving Charlie alone on the balcony to brood over Tom's lack of effect on her, and her all too heated response to Radcliffe. Surely it was just a fluke. she thought hopefully. Surely Radcliffe was not the only one who could stir a response in her. Perhaps her lack of reaction to Thomas was merely because she'd thought of him as Beth's. Perhaps she already thought of him as a possible brother-in-law. That possibility gave her great hope. She had quite enjoyed the passion Radcliffe had wrung from her with his kisses. The marital bed would be quite an enjoyable place if it contained anything like those kisses. But if Radcliffe were the only one who could raise those passions, she had a problem. "Lady Elizabeth." Charlie turned at that surprised greeting and forced a smile as Lord Norwich stepped out onto the terrace. "My lord?" "Whatever are you doing out here on your own?" he asked with concern. "I was just thinking, my lord," she answered evasively, and found herself studying him curiously. He was a handsome man, and he had raised some response from her earlier. Of course, he wasn't nearly as striking as Radcliffe, but, scowling, she forced the other man's image from her mind. "Would you kiss me?" If he was shocked at her question, it was no more so than Charlie herself. The words popped out before she had even realized that the thought had occurred to her. She wanted to convince herself that Radcliffe was not the only one who could gain a response from her, and that her lack of response to Thomas was because he was Beth's love interest, and therefore almost a brother-in-law. To that end, it did seem she needed to kiss at least one more man. Hopefully, Norwich would be able to soothe her fears. A moment of silence passed as he contemplated her, and quite suddenly Charlie was embarrassed by her forward behaviour. Shifting uncomfortably, she cleared her throat. "I am sorry. Please, forget that I—" Her words died in her throat as he caught her arm and swept her against his chest in an embrace. Then his lips were on hers, firm and forceful, pressing her head back. Clutching at his shoulders, Charlie gasped in surprise, and he took immediate advantage of that, his tongue sweeping in to conquer. He was most masterful, and Charlie felt relief slide over her as she felt the first faint stirrings of a response awaken within her. It was a short-lived relief. The faint stirring was as much as he could muster from her, and Charlie's heart sank slowly as the embrace continued. Even his caresses did not help. They were pleasant, but did little more than capture her attention. They raised no fire, fanned no flames, left her lukewarm, not feverish. It was most distressing, not that Norwich seemed to notice. While her response was tepid, his was more heated. She could feel how affected he was by the bulge pressing against her stomach. "Elizabeth!" Norwich released her so abruptly that Charlie stumbled a step or two before regaining her balance and turning in resignation to face the owner of that voice. It figured that Radcliffe would show up again at another inconvenient moment. Really, the man had to work on his timing. Charlie watched Radcliffe pace the floor with growing irritation. After snapping her name on the balcony, there had been a tense moment as everyone had merely stared at each other. Then Radcliffe had snarled that it was time to leave. Embarrassed at being caught once again in a man's embrace, Charlie had rushed silently back into the ballroom. Radcliffe had whirled to follow, then taken her arm in hand and steered her firmly out of the ballroom, the house, and into his carriage, then had sat in contemptuous silence all the way back to the townhouse. It was that contempt that had slowly worn away Charlie's embarrassment and guilt, and begun to awaken a responding anger in herself, an anger that had only grown as he had marched her tight-lipped into the townhouse, straight to the library, where he had slammed the door shut, left her standing before his desk, and begun to pace irately before her. He had been pacing for a good 10 minutes, and aside from being angry, Charlie was impatient now as well. It was partially his fault, after all. If he had not kissed her, she never would have realized how important that part of marriage could be. She would not have. Her thoughts died as he suddenly stopped pacing and whirled to face her. "I do not know what has come over you. Twice tonight I caught you kissing men out on the balcony. And once you kissed me yourself," she snapped back, her face flushing with embarrassment despite her anger. "Aye. Did you think then that meant you could run about kissing everyone?" "I hardly did that,"
Charlie fought the guilty flush that wanted to colour her cheeks. "I did not even kiss Thomas. He kissed me. It was unexpected, and if it makes you any happier, I did not enjoy it in the least." That seemed to bring him up short. His gaze narrowed. "And Norwich?" He would ask that, she thought, but admitted, "I asked him to kiss me." Radcliffe seemed to deflate with disappointment. "Why?" She debated whether to lie, but he looked so miserable. "Because I do not care for Tom's kisses." He blinked in confusion. "Tom's kisses?" "Aye. He is a skilled kisser, I can tell, but his kisses did not affect me at all." Radcliffe shook his head, as if trying to scatter a fog clouding his brain. "You asked Norwich to kiss you because Tom's kisses did not affect you." When she nodded solemnly, he was silent for a moment, then. "And did you like Norwich's kisses?" Charlie hesitated. "They were nice." "Nice?" "Aye, they were pleasant enough, but they did not make my knees go all weak and my stomach quiver, as if it were full of butterflies," she admitted, then glanced up with surprise when he was suddenly standing before her, a hair's breadth away. "And whose kisses do that to you?" he asked, huskily. Charlie swallowed. Her breathing had turned shallow at his proximity, the blood roaring in her ears like rushing water. He breathed, raising a hand to the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. It immediately began to race. "Do my kisses affect you that way?" Charlie swallowed again to keep from groaning as his fingers slid down to trace the neckline of her gown across the swells of her breasts. His other hand slid to her neck, rising until his fingers curved around the base of her skull, his thumb resting before her ear and caressing gently. Charlie's eyes closed, her face pressing into his palm like a cat nuzzling its owner. "Do they?" he whispered, his head lowering until his lips were inches away from her own, his breath a warm caress across her mouth. "Aye," she moaned in defeat as the finger at her neckline feathered over her breast, brushing one painfully erect nipple through the cloth of her gown. "Radcliffe." His breath catching at that plea, he finally dropped his lips to hers. It was as if he had poured whiskey on embers. The flame exploded within her, her body arching violently, pressing her breasts hungrily against his chest. Head falling back, she opened her mouth for his invasion and clung desperately to his shoulders. For a few moments it seemed more a battle than a kiss. Both of them were fighting for more, demanding it. There was no tenderness, just burning need as they devoured each other, bodies thrusting and hands grasping. Then Radcliffe broke free of the kiss, to worship her chin, cheek, then her earlobe with his mouth. Charlie shuddered wildly as his tongue laved her. His hand slid to cup her breast through her gown, and she cried out as he squeezed it frenziedly. When he released her at once, she nearly wept with disappointment until she felt his hand at the neckline of her gown, tugging at it until he had freed her breast to his uninhibited touch. "Oh, God!" he breathed into her ear as his hand closed over the warm swell of flesh, and Charlie gasped as his thumb brushed over her puckered nipple. When the weakness she had spoken of suddenly hit her knees and she sagged in his arms, he slid one leg between hers, his thigh rubbing against her pelvis through the cloth of their apparel. "Please," she breathed into his ear, nipping at the succulent lobe, then sucking hungrily until he pulled his head away and pushed her back against one arm to drop his mouth to the breast he had revealed. Hands catching in his hair, she twisted her head feverishly, shaking her hair loose from its pins. But then she wanted his kisses again, needed them, and she tugged at his hair until he released her breast and claimed her lips once more. Running her hands over his chest, she suddenly pushed his coat off of his shoulders, and he helped her, shrugging out of one sleeve, then the other. It wasn't enough for Charlie, though. She wanted his bare flesh against her own, and she began tugging at the buttons of his shirt. Releasing a half-chuckle, half-growl at her frustrated whimper, as she struggled with the buttons, Radcliffe tugged the shirt out of his breeches and slipped button after button free of its hole until the shirt hung loose. Charlie immediately pressed her hands to his chest, marvelling over the hard strength of him, the width,
the curly dark hairs that brushed her fingers, making them tingle. She bent to press a kiss to the very center of his chest, then shifted her lips to one small pebble-like nipple, closing her lips around it as he had done to her. She grazed it with her teeth, then gasped in surprise as Radcliffe suddenly stiffened and pushed her away. Her eyes shot to his face in hurt surprise until she recognized the intense look he had acquired. Then she heard Beth's voice sing out, vibrant with excitement. "Sharp! Elizabeth! Beth!" Her footsteps pounded up the stairs and faded. She saw the passion fade from Radcliffe's eyes to be replaced with regret, and felt her anger stir. "Do not even consider apologizing for what just happened," she warned icily. "It was as much my fault as yours, and I enjoyed it too much to be sorry." Radcliffe's eyebrows shot up even as his jaw dropped. Charlie felt at least a smidgen of satisfaction at that fact as she rucked her neckline back up, smoothed her skirt, lifted her chin, and sailed out of the room before he could regain his voice. "There you are!" Rushing down the stairs, Beth grabbed her arm excitedly. "You will not believe it. I am so happy. Thomas has asked me to—" When Beth closed her mouth abruptly, Charlie glanced over her shoulder, not in the least surprised to see Radcliffe standing in the door to the library. No one looking at him now would believe he had been in flagrante delicto just moments ago, unlike herself, she supposed, with a sigh, running a self-conscious hand through her hair. "Thomas asked you to what?" Radcliffe queried when Beth stared at him blankly. "He, to—" Panic began to colour her face, then it cleared. "Go hunting with him. In the country. For a couple of days." She was positively beaming with happiness Charlie very much doubted had anything to do with hunting. But it had been a good save, and Charlie could not resist smiling in return, until Radcliffe said, "I'm afraid that is impossible." "What?" Beth and Charlie both cried the word at once, turning to glare at him. "I am sorry. You cannot go." He did not sound sorry. "How would it look?" "How would what look?" Beth asked, warily, her gaze shooting to Charlie, who had also stiffened at his words. Did he know? Did he know they were both girls? And if he did, how long had he known? "You're running off to go hunting and leaving your sister alone here with me. Unchaperoned." Unchaperoned? Charlie relaxed. He did not know. "Radcliffe, everyone thinks you are our cousin. I have no need of a chaperone. Everyone thinks we are cousins now, but what happens when it comes out that we are not related? What then? There would be whispers about the fact that at some point during the charade Charles had run off leaving you here unchaperoned. Besides, our supposedly being cousins does not make us above scandal. Cousins marry all the time." "But—" Beth began desperately. "It is all right," Charlie murmured, drawing her sister's reluctant gaze. "Come, you can tell me all about your night." Taking her arm, she urged her up the stairs, and Beth allowed herself to be led to Elizabeth's room. Once there, however, she tugged her arm free and turned on Charlie defiantly. "I told Tom everything. All about us." "I'm not surprised. He seemed very upset when he left the ball." Beth grimaced. "He was furious. He was also confused. He said that kissing you was like kissing Clarissa. He could not figure out what was going on. But he wasn't happy seeing you, me, in Radcliffe's arms. Well, who he thought was me." Charlie nodded solemnly. "So, you told him everything, and—" Happiness exploded on her face. "And he asked me to marry him." "I thought as much," Charlie admitted with a grin, and hurried forward to hug her, truly happy for her sister. "Congratulations." "Oh, Charlie," Beth squeezed her desperately. "I love him so. What am I to do?" "Do?" Charlie pulled back to look at her with surprise. "Why, you shall marry him, of course." "But Thomas wants to elope to Gretna Green at once. He is waiting out front." "Then you had best hurry and get ready, hadn't you?" Releasing her, Charlie rushed into the dressing room. "Why?" Beth asked miserably, following to find her searching through the gowns they had received so far from the dressmaker. "Radcliffe is not going to let me out the door. He is afraid for Elizabeth's reputation." And he is right, Charlie said absently as she packed the lavender gown in a satchel. Elizabeth should not be here alone. Aside from our reputations, there is the blackmailer to consider. Radcliffe would never let Elizabeth out alone at night, and criminals do seem to like to arrange their meetings at night. Beth watched her pack away various toiletries, her confusion slowly turning to understanding. So, Elizabeth will rush off to elope with Thomas, and Charles will remain here, she reasoned out slowly, beginning to glow with happiness. Nay. Beth's glow died an abrupt death. Nay. Nay, of course not. How on earth can I find a husband for myself as Charles? Impossible. Ridiculous. Completely hopeless. Then why are you packing a case? Beth wailed. Charlie peered at her with surprise. Why? So that you can elope, of course. But you just said— You, Beth, Charlie interrupted patiently. You are going to elope. In the meantime, Charles will be terribly under the weather and spend most of his time in his room. That way, Elizabeth's reputation is safe. Charles is available if the blackmailer arranges another meeting, and I can be Elizabeth, almost full-time, to search for a husband. You will play both roles, Beth gasped with understanding, following when Charlie snapped the satchel closed and led her from the dressing room. Only for a couple of days. Do make sure Tom hurries you back. Beth bit her lip. Tom said it would take a full day, a night, and almost another half-day to reach Gretna Green if we ride without stopping, she admitted, reluctantly. A day and a half there, and a day and a half back. Charlie began to shake her head. You will have to stop to rest the night. That means you'll be gone almost 4. Nay, we will head right back, Beth interrupted to assure her, afraid Charlie was about to change her mind after all this. It will only be 3 days. Beth, you cannot ride 3 days straight without rest, and even if you could, his horse could not. We are taking the carriage. Tom and the driver can take turns at the whip, one driving while the other rests, and we can change horses, regularly, she added as Charlie began to look hopeful. Do you think Thomas will agree to all this? He loves me, was Beth's simple answer. Smiling wryly, Charlie nodded. Very well. And once you get back, you can play Charles full-time. It will give you a chance to spend as much time alone with your new husband as possible until I find one too. If I have not found one by the time you return, she added on a sigh, turning to hold the satchel out. Beth grabbed the bag in one hand, then pulled her sister into an enthusiastic hug. Oh, Charlie, you are brilliant, magnificent, incredible. I love you too, Charlie murmured, holding her close briefly. Then she pushed her away and turned to open the window. Now, you had best get going. Beth glanced at the window, her smile fading somewhat. Out the window? Charlie arched an eyebrow. Would you care to try walking right out the front door? Under Radcliffe's nose? If he catches you, the jig will be up. Aye, but— She hesitated, recollections of her encounter with the window at the inn filling her mind. What a dreadful experience that had been. Leaving her to her thoughts, Charlie peered out the window. They were on the 2nd floor above the salon, facing the road, and there was a bush directly beneath the window, offering a cushion should Beth fall. Her gaze slid to the street to see Thomas pacing anxiously beside the Mowbray carriage. Placing 2 fingers in her mouth, Charlie used the whistle the stable-master at home had taught her while working with the horses. The piercing sound drew Tom's head around at once, spying her at the window. He rushed forward to stand by the bushes beneath the window, gesturing for him to stay put and remain quiet. Charlie turned back to Beth and took the bag she had packed. She dropped it into the bushes, waiting until Tom scrambled to remove it before turning back to her sister. He is waiting for you, she said gently. Tom! Startled from her thoughts, Beth leaned out the window to wave at her husband-to-be before straightening again. I can do this. She didn't sound at all certain. Smiling, Charlie hugged her one last time. We have already escaped unwanted marriages, fled inns in the middle of the night, made our way to London, and fooled the entire ton into thinking we are brother and sister. Beth, I think we can do anything we set our minds to.
Grinning, Beth stepped back. "We are rather daring, are we not?"
"Bold as brass," she agreed cheerfully. Straightening her shoulders, Beth turned and crawled out to sit on the window ledge before glancing back.
3 days.
3 days, Charlie agreed, then gasped in alarm when Beth pushed herself off the ledge. Leaning forward, she peered down to see Thomas, holding her cradled in his arms, having caught her. Releasing her legs, he let her stand. The couple kissed briefly, then glanced up, waved and hurried through the darkness to the waiting carriage. Charlie watched them ride out of sight, then closed the window with a sigh. 3 days. Chapter 14. Charlie had never imagined that time could pass so slowly. These past 3 days had seemed more like a week to her. She had played Charles each evening since Beth's leaving, donning the wig, jumping into bed, and pulling the linens up to cover her gown as Bessie delivered Charles's tray at dinner time. Dressed as Elizabeth, she had taken up the morning and afternoon trays herself, much to Bessie's relief. The girl was quite busy with the puppies, taking them for walks, then fussing over the fact that they seemed to be off their food. Little did she know that the reason for this sudden drop in their voracious appetites was that they were snacking on the food meant for Charles. Pacing to the salon window, Charlie peered out. There was still no sign of Radcliffe's carriage. They were supposed to have left for the Somerville's ball 4 hours ago, but Radcliffe had never arrived home to take her. She had gone from irritation to anger to anxiety, and now she was worried silly that something had happened to him. The sound of the front door closing drew her glance out the window again to see that Radcliffe's carriage had returned. Turning smartly, she hurried into the hall in time to see Stokes disappearing with his master's gloves, cape, and hat. "You are home." About to step into the library, Radcliffe paused and glanced at her with surprise, then changed direction and moved toward the room she had just exited. "Oh, good evening, Elizabeth." "Did you have a good day?" she asked sweetly, following him into the salon and watching as he poured himself a drink from a carafe on the table. "Very good, actually. That investment I made, the one I included you and Charles in, has paid out. We tripled our money," he murmured with satisfaction, then swallowed some of his drink. "That is where I have been, actually." Charlie's tension eased, her anger dissipating quickly. He had been tending to business. That was why he had not arrived home to take her to the Somerville's ball. She could hardly be angry at him for that. She could not expect the man to give up his life or shirk his business to aid her in finding a husband, she thought. And then he added, "I was out celebrating with some of the other investors." Radcliffe had raised the glass to his lips again when a missile flew at him. Catching it out of the corner of his eye, he dodged it automatically, sloshing port all over the place as he did. It smashed against the wall behind him, and he stared at it with amazement, then turned in time to see Elizabeth's skirts disappear through the door. "What the deuce?" Setting his glass down, he hurried after her. She was halfway up the stairs when he stepped into the hall. "What the devil was that all about?" he shouted after her, taking to the stairs himself. Not having anything close to hand to hurl at him, Charlie did not deign to stop and answer him. Instead, she picked up her pace in an effort to avoid him. Unfortunately, the constricting farthingale that women were forced to wear to be fashionable tended to make little things like breathing difficult, and running was out of the question without air, which was why Radcliffe caught her on the landing. "I want an answer." Catching her arm, he dragged her around to face him. "What was that all about?" Pressing her hand to her chest, Charlie made a determined effort to regain her breath, then offered him a perplexed look. "What, my lord?" "In the salon," he snapped. "You threw something at me." "Did I?" she murmured. "I must have been terribly angry." "Aye. But about what?" "Do you know, my lord, I think I have forgotten." "Forgotten?" He stared at her, dumbfounded, and she nodded solemnly. "Aye, just like you obviously forgot about the Somerville's ball." Turning on that note, she headed down the hall toward Elizabeth's room. "Oh, damn," Radcliffe breathed, squeezing his eyes closed for a moment, then blinking them open again as she reached the door to her room. "Elizabeth, I am sorry." I meant only to have one, maybe 2 drinks, then head home. But I—" She whirled on him coldly. "You are not sorry, my lord? Pray, do not pretend that you are." "But I am." "Is that right? Well, pray forgive me if I find it hard to believe in light of your recent